Hello writers! So in the previous video, I went over reading strategies that you can do before you begin to read. And I discussed that doing background, establishing goals could really be important in motivating us as we read. So in this video though, we'll be talking about what are strategies that you can do while you are actually reading. So these are the reading strategies that I'll be going over. First is goal monitoring, reading rhetorically, vocabulary clarification, passage clarification, visualization, and making connections, and questioning. So the first is monitoring. So as you read, you want to make sure that you highlight or you make notes on the information that is connected to those goals. So this one will only be able to be used if you already established goals before you began to read. So if you chose to establish goals before you began to read, then you want to continue with that, right? You will also be able to use other strategies, but it will not be helpful to just say, these are my goals, and then never do nothing with them. So goal monitoring forces you to highlight and make note of your goals. So going back to the goals that I had established for Deborah Brand's Sponsorship Literacy. So this is the article that I used in the previous video, and it's the article that I will continue to use in this video to show you all how to apply these strategies in your own reading. So these were the goals that I had established previously, which was to learn what sponsorship literacy are and to learn some examples of them so I could see if they connect to my own real life. So I discussed that I established these goals purely based on just the article. So at times we will not have the time to do research on who the author is. We will only just have what's right there on that first page, which is the title of the article. Just based purely on that, we can also skim through it, look at the title, the subheadings, look at any images, captions, anything that's in bold to also help us establishing the goals. If there is an abstract, which is an overall summary of the article that is really important to read to also help establish our goals. So I was able to highlight, so again, I'm pretending that I'm reading this article, and as I got to this particular section, I highlighted this sentence that starts with sponsors, as I have come to think of them, and end with or withhold literacy is the definition of sponsorship literacy. So that is my goal. So if I were to be trying to prove to my professor I did this strategy, this is what I would do. I would highlight the section from the text that's connected to my goal, and I would identify this is goal number one, or this connects to goal number one because this is the definition to the sponsorship literacy. Strategy number two is rhetorical reading, which is reading like a writer. So it's something that I talked about in the first video. So to write or communicate rhetorically means to do so effectively, to do so well. So when you communicate rhetorically, it means that you're constantly thinking about audience, purpose, and form. Who is my audience? Why am I writing to them? What am I trying to say to them? And how am I gonna do so? If you wanna think like a writer, right? Because we're all writers and we will eventually be writing. Reading is what really helps us establish what do other established authors do that maybe I can use in my own writing. So this is something that you can focus on while you read. So you can question, okay, how does the audience influence and affect the decisions made by the author or authors as it was written, right? So pay attention to the author's writing style and their voice, which is their point of view. You can pay attention to the overall organization, the way that it was presented, the genre of it, and the author's methodology, the research that they had to do to get an answer to their question or find a solution to their problem. Again, I'm going to be using Brand's article. Previously had established what her purpose was, right? So in the previous reading like a writer, one of the questions was establishing who is the audience and what is Deborah Brand's purpose. So I had established that her purpose was to educate others, specifically educators, on what is it that she discovered about literacy, right? So now I want to look at the other things. So based on, okay, what I know who her audience is and what her purpose is, I'm going to have that in mind to see how did this affect her style. So because she is trying to have a conversation with educator, she needs to establish her credibility, right? So she needs to make sure that she comes across as someone who I can trust. Specifically because educators are really skeptical, right? That's one of the things that we're always constantly teaching to students, like, hey, make sure that you can trust your source. So Brant already knows educators are going to be a little bit iffy, so I need to make sure that they can know that they can trust me, that I'm credible, and I want them to know that they can trust what I'm going to say. So she does this in this first initial sentence right here. This essay does not presume to overcome the analytical failure completely, but it does offer a conceptual approach. So basically, in this fancy words, she's saying, hey, look, I'm not going to answer completely the questions that you may have, but I tried. I tried to do so, right? So she's establishing like, hey, look, you might have some questions at the end of this, but it's okay. You know, I'm attempting to give you information that is necessary, right? So that's, you know, something that has affected her style. So something that affected her voice is that her point of view, right? So voice is our point of view on something. So this is Brandt's point of view on what literacy, which is that it's impacted by others. And that came from this sentence right here that starts with sponsors and her definition of what sponsors are. So if I were to try to prove to my professor I'm doing these strategies, this is what I would do. I would highlight the particular section that I think is connected to either her style or voice, and I would identify this is something that connects to her style, and this is why I think so, or this is the effect that it has. So what about her organization? So her organization of that last paragraph of her introduction, so she really has a lengthy introduction because she's trying to establish a lot of background. Again, she wants to be very clear with what her article will be about so that educators will stay all the way to the end, right? They won't stop reading and just like go look at something else, right? So that's one of the things that has affected her style. She wants to make sure that she talks and discusses about every little thing that a reader would need to know, a lot of background. So she has a lengthy introduction. And in that last few sentences of her introduction, she has an overall summary of the article. So it starts off with, in this essay, I set out to do this, blah, 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 blah. Then I'm gonna use extended case examples, blah, 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 blah. And a final section addresses blah, 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 blah. Right? So it's a crystal clear organization of what her article will be about. I thought that was pretty helpful. As a reader, I would definitely have loved to have this in other articles as well. Just know exactly what am I about to read. So like I said, Deborah Brand does not have an abstract, but this pretty much is like an abstract, a summary of her article. So again, if I wanted to prove to my professor that I'm applying the strategies, I will highlight this section. I will identify this is a choice that she made in her organization, that it's helpful, and I think this is something that I would try in my own writing, right? Because after all, that's the purpose of this strategy, to try to identify things that you would like to do in your own writing. So her methodology. Her methodology was to do interviews. She did 100 in-depth interviews between 1900 and 1980, which was quite a while ago. So the choices that she made in her methodology was because that was around the time when she did her research, and her research article was published a little bit after. So I don't know the exact date when it was published, but it was published around the 1990s. So that's why it's a little bit dated. The choice that she did to really talk about, look, I did 100 interviews and I did it between 80 years. It took me 80 years to do this research. I should say not that she did 80 years, but that she got people born between 1900 and 1980, which meant that she got people of all sorts of ages and cultures and races. So she has a really diverse range of people that she interviewed. But her research was still published in around the 1990s, so got a little bit of information incorrect there. But what she's trying to do here is she's trying to, again, prove to her educator audience that, hey, I did my research, you can trust me. Though, as someone who's reading this, I'll have definitely questions about, I'm not sure that all of this would be really connected to my own life now, since these people are clearly older than me. I would definitely have questions about that. So again, as someone who's trying to prove to my professor I did the strategy, I will highlight things like this. I will make note of what this stands for, which is her methodology, and just your thoughts on that. Again, these are the things that you want to question as you are applying the rhetorical reading, which is look at the author's style and voice, their organization, their presentation, their genre, and their methodology. And how did all these different choices that they made, why did they do those choices, right? Again, you have to have known what their audience is, what their purpose is, before being able to apply these strategies. All right, so the third strategy is vocabulary clarification. So this strategy will help us determine what unfamiliar terms to define when we come across them as we read the article. So oftentimes we may be reading an article where every sentence or so we have to stop because there's a word that we really don't know, that we've never seen before. And if you stop to define every single word, that would just take too long. So this strategy is going to help us to determine, should I go and waste time defining what this word is or not? So when you first come across an unfamiliar word, the thing that you want to do is rank it on a scale of 1 through 4. 1 being, I have never seen or heard this word before. 2 is, I have seen this word, but I don't know what it means. 3 is, I have some idea of what this word means. And 4 is, I know what this word means and I have used it before. And really, if you're ranking it between 3 and 4, you know that, hey, why am I even going to bother to look up this word if I have some idea? So if it falls into a 1 or a 2, which is like I'm lost with this word, then that's when we can move on to the next steps. So again, I'm going to show you how to apply this strategy using Deborah Brand's Sponsors of Literacy. So at this point, I'm in step 1. I just came across this word, sponsors, and I am assigning it a 2 because I have some idea of what it is. Like, I know that it's been used, about this person helped sponsor this student, this person, so that they could, play the sport, but I've never used or seen it used in connection to literacy before. So that's why it's a 2, because I have no idea how it's been used in this word. So step 2 is, if you rank it between a 1 and a 2, then you need to ask yourself the next questions. Because even if it's one of those words that you don't know, you don't always have to define it. So ask yourself these questions before you do. Does it appear in the title or subheading? Right? Is the word in bold? Does the word repeat throughout the text? Is it a content word, such as a noun, which is a person, place, or thing, or a verb that it tells an action? So these questions will help us identify, is this word important for the article? If it's not, then I'm not going to bother at all to look it up, because I'm just going to be wasting my time. So applying it to Deborah Brand's, does it appear in the title? Yes, definitely. It's called Sponsors of Literacy. Is the word in bold? In this particular case, no. Does the word repeat throughout the text? Yes. Just within this little section that I have screenshotted, it appears twice. Is it a content word, such as a noun, a person, place, or thing, or a verb? It tells an action. This seems to be indicating some sort of like thing of literacy, so I'm gonna go with yes. So I answered yes to 3 of the 4, which means that this is definitely one of those words that I want to define. So step 3 will be to create your own definition. So this is one of those optional things. If you have some time, I would encourage you to create your own definition. Why? Because it is more likely that you remember your definition of the word than it would be to look up in Google and memorize word for word what Google said the definition of that word to be, right? So if you put in the time to learn what this word means, the next time you come across it, you will not need to Google it. You will not need to look up in the dictionary what the word means. You will already know what it means. So if you are one of those who wants to expand your vocabulary, I would encourage you to try to create your own definition of it before you look it up in the dictionary. So this would have been the definition that I would have come up with for sponsors, which is sponsors are people and things that can either help or hurt you. That was the understanding that I got based purely on what I read. So I'm using context clues for this, which is that I read the next sentence after that. The next sentence starts with sponsors as I have come to think of them, and that's literally Deborah Brown's defining what sponsors of literacy is. So that was really helpful. So that's the thing about creating your own definition, that you're not always doing it on your own. You use context clues, look at what's around it to get an understanding of what is this word about? What does this word mean? So again, if you're trying to prove to your professor that you are doing this strategy, you want to make sure that you highlight the word, that you indicate the ranking of when it falls, 1, 2, 3, 4. You give your definition, which is optional, but again, I would encourage you to do so. And then finally, you look it up in the dictionary. So after that, you indicate the dictionary definition, the definition of it. So that is vocabulary clarification, which is step 1, rank the term. Step 2, determine if it's worth defining. Step 3, use context clues to try to define it. Step 4, use the dictionary to define it. So it might seem like this is a lot of work. You said that this would save time, but the more times that you do it, this would be more automatic. You automatically see a word and know this is a 1, 2. You would be able to quickly, in a few seconds, just look around, scan around to see if it's worth defining, come up with your own definition in a few seconds, and then, look it up. So the more time that you practice using this, the more that it will go from like a 2-3 minute activity to a minute activity. So you will be saving some time as you practice this strategy. All right. The next strategy is called passage clarification. So this strategy is used when you come across a section of the article that is confusing or difficult to understand, which is something that may happen while you're reading an article. Some of the things may be a breeze, some things may be a little bit more confusing. So what can you do? So step 1 is to place brackets. So you want to indicate, this is what I'm having trouble with. I like to ask students to ask questions when having lectures on the articles, and it would be really important to know what specifically do you have questions on. So if you mark the section, the sentence, the paragraph, which is like an entire subheading, that this is what I'm having trouble with, this will really help your professor help clarify what confusions you have. So that's the first step, right? So again, I'm going to be using Deborah Brown's. So I would have put a bracket in the entire last few sentences of this paragraph, which starts with, this even as we recognize that the most pressing issues we deal with, and ends with, that occupy so many of us on a daily basis. So step 1 is identifying, I have no idea what this just said. So I'm going to put this in brackets. So it's okay if it's a whole paragraph that you're having trouble. Step 2 is to try to translate it, to put it in your own words, what you think this is saying. So just like the previous strategy of vocabulary clarification, when you're trying to put it in your own words because you're more likely to remember your definition of it than the dictionaries, that's the same mindset that applies here, where you're more likely to understand your own words, your own summary of what's going on, than the way that Deborah Brown. Again, because Deborah Brown has the audience of educators, she's using all this superfluous vocabulary to really show off and have a conversation with other educators who would understand what she's saying. So since students are not the audience, there may be some lost in translation, right? So even as an educator, some of these things were, just because of her overall style, might have been a little bit like confusing, that took like maybe 2-3 times to read and be like, oh, okay, I get what you're saying now, right? So translate it, put it in your own words, what you understand from the author, right? So I started off first by identifying what I'm confused about. So again, if you want to prove to your professor, like, hey, I'm applying these strategies, I would encourage you to start off with, this is what I'm confused about. It also just really helps when it comes to discussion of identifying what specifically did you have questions on. So I wrote here, I am confused here. But this is what I understood, right? So I think it means that literacy affects how well we do in life, but yet it is not studied the way life affects how we develop literacy, right? So there's a cause and effect, but it's not really studied here. So that was the understanding that I got. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, right? That's something that I'm going to bring up to my professor. Like, I'm confused because I'm not sure if this is what Bryant was talking about. So, again, this is what you would do with passive clarification. Step 1, identify what's the part that's confusing, and 2, try to put it in your own words. Step 3, which I didn't write here, would be bring it up to your professor. Show it to your professor, indicate this is the section that I'm having some trouble with and I would like some clarification, right? Another thing would be talk to a fellow peer who you are comfortable talking to and say, hey, I'm kind of confused in this section. Were you able to understand? The next strategy is called visualization. So visualization is another way to translate it, right, the section into your own words, but this time instead of using like sentences, you will use visuals. So these are some of the visuals that you could create. Sketches, stick figures, if you're not a big drawer like me, graphic organizers, and concept maps. So I'm using that same section that I had confusion over in the previous strategy, but now instead of translating it using that sentence that I had, these would be the visuals that I would create. So I have this weird looking sketch on the bottom, which looks like a circle and a bunch of arrows pointing at people, indicating that that's life. And in the other hand, we have literacy with an arrow pointing up and down, indicating that literacy could increase or decrease based on the effects that life have on people, right? That was my definition of that section, which was the same as the one that I had previously written, except instead of writing it out, I did this weird looking stick figures, right? So you can choose to do that same drawing, but this time using other visuals that require less artwork, such as concept maps or graphic organizers, right? So again, visualization is summarizing using sketches, stick figures, graphic organizers, or concept maps. The next strategy is making connections. So this strategy will help us bridge our ideas and experiences with those discussed in the reading. So I don't know if y'all are familiar with the term passive and active reading. Passive readers, basically you're just reading what's on the page and doing nothing with it. Active reader is someone who's constantly questioning why. Why should I have to read this? What does this have to do with my life? Right? Which is something that we try to bridge by making goals, right? Establishing reading goals. But if you don't make reading goals, you can still question and try to establish what connections do I have. So these are questions that you can ask yourself, or not necessarily questions, but things that you can say to indicate the connections you have. So for example, this reminds me of the time my mom, my neighbor, my teacher did this, right? So you're making connections between something that the author said and something that's related to your own life. Something similar happened to my best friend or a character, right? Or you can indicate what a particular section, how it makes you feel. This makes me feel sad, angry, and why. So indicate why that's the case. This is similar to what I read in blank when this happened, right? So definitely making connections to other things that you have read, and not necessarily like books, poems, but also scholarly articles where other research that connects to the topic is definitely important when writing research papers, to try to start making connections between one author and myself. This is how I would apply this strategy or use the strategy if I was reading Sponsors of Literacy. So I would highlight the definition of sponsors of literacy, which starts with sponsors, as I have come to think of them, are any agents, local or distant, concrete or abstract, who enable, support, teach, model, as well as recruit, regulate, suppress, or withhold literacy. So I would write on next to it, this reminds me of the way teachers and parents play a role in how we learn to read and write, not just how we learn, but how we feel towards the act of reading and writing. So that's the connection that I made. What did this remind me of? It reminded me of people in my own life, teachers and parents who help me read and write, right? So again, this is what you would do if you want to prove to your professor, hey, I am using my strategy by highlighting the section and then indicating the connection you made, right? So again, Make connections involves you realizing, hey, this reminds me of something, this makes me feel a certain way. Just to really try to have a conversation between what is on the page and what you have experienced. So the next and final strategy is called questioning. So this strategy will help us further engage with the ideas being discussed by questioning the author. So in the previous one, it's really about making connections between the author's information and yourself. So it's a lot of, hey, I agree with this, hey, I'm feeling this way. And questioning is more of like, why am I feeling this way? Is the author really serious about this? Do I really believe this is true, right? One of the things that you can question is having confusion. So being confused about something is definitely that one of the most important questions that you could ask. Questioning, I don't know what this means, this is why. Do I wonder questions? Like, I wonder why this is true, I wonder when this happened, right? I'm curious about this, and this is why, right? So if I was applying this strategy to sponsors of literacy, I would highlight this sentence: the investigation is grounded on more than 100 in-depth interviews. And then I would indicate, somewhere on the page why that caught my attention. So I would write, I'm curious about brand, right? Or about how brand decided which interviews to focus on in her article, because one article is not enough to talk about 100 interviews. She only talked about 5 interviews in her entire article. So one of the questions that I had was, what made the 5 individuals she talked about special? So I'm never going to talk to Deborah Brand, so I'm never going to get an answer to this question. And if I brought this question to the professor, they may not have an answer to it, and that's fine. When you question, you don't necessarily have to always get an answer, but it helps establish this curiosity to read like writers. If I were to do a research paper eventually where I need to do interviews, I want to know or get an understanding of, like, how do people select the information that will go into the interviews, right? These were the strategies that we talked about in this video. So goal monitoring, reading rhetorically, vocabulary clarification, passage clarification, visualization, making connections, and questioning. So the first 2, goal monitoring and rhetorical reading, are definitely strategies that you have to do some legwork before you start reading, such as you already have to have established goals to be able to monitor those goals. You already have to know what the author's purpose and their audience is to be able to continue with that, of understanding how that affects the choices that they made. But the next 5 strategies can be used on their own. You can define vocabulary, you can define things that you're confused by either writing it out or using visuals. You could definitely make connections between what you read and your own life, and you could start questioning things that you're confused about or things that you're curious about as you read. Why should you apply strategies as you read? Well, something that I had mentioned previously is an act of passive versus active reading. So passive readers simply read what's on the page and move on. Active readers are those who are constantly doing things with the actual reading. So one of the things that would prevent us from really comprehending what we're reading is to not really read. To really just look at the words on the page and move on, just to say that you did it, right? Active reader is to try to do something, whether it's as simple as just highlighting words, circling things, doing little doodles, things that will keep our brain constantly engaged with the reading, will help us more than likely comprehend and understand what we're reading. That was all the strategies that I have for you for while we read. In the next video, I'll be talking about strategies that you can do after we finish reading. So strategies after we read are just as important as those while we are reading, maybe even more important.